Cecilia Cromwell Day. This is the session on reproductive injustice, white supremacy, and feminist resistance strategies. So my name is Carrie Baker, and I'm the director of the program for the study of women and gender. And I teach a class here at Smith, actually, on reproductive justice. It will be in the coming semester. And so we are thrilled to have with us today Loretta Ross, who had a great question earlier in the session. And Loretta was founder and director of Sister Song for many years. Sister Song is in Atlanta, and it's a Women of Color Reproductive Justice Coalition. And before that, she worked at the Center for Democratic Renewal, which is an anti-hate group organization that did research on hate groups. And before that, she was in Washington, D.C., the National Organization for Women, and with the D.C. Rape Crisis Center, the third director, I think, of that center, and that was one of the first rape crisis centers in the country. So, Loretta, I'm just going to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you. Though I really want to encourage Carrie. Thank you, Carrie, for that introduction. We should give you a hand. Carrie and I were supposed to share the stage today, but she came with a PowerPoint and the room is not equipped to facilitate her presentation. And so what I'm inviting her to do is to co-present with me and interrupt and augment anything I've got to say. I'm not as thorough as Carrie, so I didn't even bring notes, much less a PowerPoint. I'm kind of like, fly by the seat of my pants, Loretta. So I just want you to understand that this is supposed to be a co-presentation. It's not a singular one by Loretta. But we'll see how it works. Is that okay? Obviously, the topic is reproductive justice, reproductive injustice, white supremacy, and feminism. But I'm actually going to start with the middle phrase, white supremacy, because reproductive justice is a response to white supremacy that black women created, and I'll tell you about that. And then I'm going to end by talking about how that informs the larger feminist project of resistance, if that's okay with y'all. I'm one of those that prefer to take questions as I talk, as opposed to piling them up like a car wreck at the end. Because I like questions at the moment they're pertinent to what I've said, as opposed to trying to go back and say, well, I said that 20 minutes ago, but we've moved on and stuff. And so if you don't mind, I'd rather integrate the questions and make this much more of a conversation or a dialogue than a monologue by me and Carrie, and then perhaps not have enough time at the end for questions. So is that okay with folks? I do have to confess that I have the world's worst memory, so you may have to help me remember where I was when I stopped, because I had a really good time in the 60s. And you get to imagine how much fun we had. But let's first talk about white supremacy. I really did enjoy Roxanne's remarks about racism. And if there's one small thing that I wish she had done more of, is say the phrase white supremacy. Because racism is simply only one component of white supremacy. And if we overly focus on that one component, we miss the misogyny, the transphobia, the native nationalism, the Christian fundamentalism, the homophobia, the ableism, all those other parts that create that totalizing system that we define as white supremacy. I mean, Trump also mocked a disabled reporter, and that was just as important as sending a dog whistle to his base as him pretending that Obama wasn't an American. These things are important, and that's what congeals the white tribalistic resistance to modernity. Because they're not just worried about black people, which is, of course, they always are worried about black people and people of color, but they're also worried about trans people having access to the bathrooms. They're worried about people who don't share their narrow Christian fundamentalist beliefs. We have to address it as a totalizing body of ideas. And the other thing that people mistake when they think about white supremacy is that they think white supremacy is a phrase to describe a race of people. Now, of course, white supremacy was created by white people, but not all white people are white supremacists, okay? And not all people who are white supremacists are white. Ben Carson comes to mind. You know, other people of color enablers, Jewish enablers of this bullshit. I mean, I'm sorry, this is being recorded. I said I was gonna keep it clean. I can't promise, but I'll try. Not all white people are white supremacists, and not all white supremacists are white. I need to restate that again. If you buy into that body of ideas that I'm identifying as white supremacy, you are a white supremacist. Now, the most painful thing you can tell a white person is that they're a racist. I have participated in the deprogramming of people in hate groups, standing there in their Klan robes. And the first thing they'll say out of their mouth, I'm not a racist. The mind boggles. Because if you're wearing Nazi insignia and you're in a Klan robe or whatever, it's hard for me to accept that you're so self-unaware of what you're doing and what it represents. But most people, crazy as it may sound, like to think of themselves as good people. And so they don't associate being a good person with being a racist. And so whenever you're fighting white supremacy, you kind of have to get that I'm not a racist out of the way. Matter of fact, don't even start there, because immediately the listening will shut down, because you've already told them that they're not good people and stuff. And if you want to continue that conversation, you need to learn other ways of saying it. And so one of my favorites that I'm using nowadays is, of course, not everybody who voted for Donald Trump was a racist. I think you just are a little bit racially challenged. It's a softer way of saying it, but means the same thing, because they enabled a racist, even if they are not a racist. It's kind of like, maybe you're not the people who goes around groping women, but your silence enabled the practice. You know, on, and you can use useful analogies like that to help people understand how they participate as bystanders in systems of oppression, or become more active. Now, when teaching about the white supremacist movement now over at Hampshire College, one of the things that I'm doing is showing how they have a long-term vision that they're operationalizing now. And most of us are really only paying attention November 9th, 2016, because we were shocked, we were surprised, we were disappointed, and for those of us who are really woke, we were alarmed. But they have a long-term vision that we need to understand. Trump is an outcome. He is not the cause. This is a country for whom white supremacy is in its DNA. It was founded on Native American genocide, the enslavement, the subjugation of women, on and on and on. And so to act like this has never happened before and I'm all surprised and blah, 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 just really shows how naive you've been allowed to sleepwalk through history and modern times, because it's always been going on. As a anti-fascist activist, I often compare myself to Chicken Little. You know, Chicken Little runs around and says, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, and nobody listens. And then on November 9th, the sky fell. And all of a sudden, everybody's listening to us talk about white supremacy. When before, when we even said the phrase, we were punished for being too hyperbolic. Excuse me. Now we can now talk about this thing called white supremacy that we should have been talking about all along, because you cannot deconstruct something you're afraid to confront and name. It just doesn't work that way. And so they've been on this plan for a long time, ever since the 1960s, when they were defeated by the civil rights movement and forced to retreat. And we had the dismantling of legalized discrimination, but they committed to regroup and come back, and this is what they've done. They're also recognizing, and when I say they, people who subscribe to the ideas of white supremacy, and that could be the far right, the religious right, economic fundamentalists, traditional bigots, alt-right. I'm collapsing all of them into white supremacy. I don't care how they euphemize their names right now, because I'm just not gonna follow that rabbit hole that they'd like me to dive in and to debate nomenclature when I'm debating ideas. But anyway, one of the reasons that they are acting the way they're acting is because they recognize, beginning in the 1960s, that first of all, in a short 30-year period, white people will not be the majority of America anymore. And so they had relied on this semblance of democracy that we have to protect white privilege. But they are also preparing for a future when the majority of voters are no longer white and won't be that committed to protecting white privilege. And they've been seeing this since the 60s. And they have been organizing white resentment, white tribalism in a very specific way since then, preparing for this demographic transition. Whether it was Richard Nixon talking about law and order, which was a dog whistle for criminalizing black people. I mean, there was one writer, I've forgotten her name right now, Naomi something or the, she said, America didn't have a crime problem that was raced. Nixon confronted a racial problem that he criminalized. And that's what we're dealing with. Racial problems that get criminalized as a form of white supremacy. And that's where the whole prison industrial complex comes from and the whole thing that we're talking about. As part of their fear of democracy, they are totally committed to deconstructing it. And that's what we're seeing now. The attacks on the judiciary, on the media, on voting rights, gerrymandering, education, workers' rights, the environment, on and on and on. The democratic mechanisms that we spent the entire 20th century trying to erect, they are deconstructing. Like they want to repeal the entire 20th century like it didn't happen. That's why they sound like these people want to refight the Civil War and see if they can win it again. Because they really are throwing back to the 19th century, wanting another shot at deconstructing America. Because that's what they're doing. That's why they are romanticizing the Civil War as a noble lost cause, not as the treason it actually was. And they are actually okay with treason when it serves their interests, as the Mueller investigation is revealing and stuff. And so they're busily deconstructing democracy, and they are calling the question on what type of America will we have? Will it be a country devoted to egalitarian principles or authoritarian principles? We're at that tipping point. And I think it's a very precious moment for us because we get to decide the same things people decided in 1776. What kind of country will this be? Now, we're better informed, and we're not all white male slave owners at the time. So I think we have a better sense of what kind of America we'd like to see than they had. But we're still at that same tipping point, that same kind of tipping point. I'm concerned that we are unappreciative of how important this moment is and stuff. And so in our panic, we need to be strategic and understand that we need a 30-year plan too. And it's a 30-year plan not just based on resistance, because actually if we return back to November 7th, we'd still have a messed up democracy. If Hillary had won, we'd still have a messed up democracy. You know, if Bernie had won, we'd have had a messed up democracy. So the question for us is, can we do it better? And will we take on our shoulders the responsibilities and the commitment to do it better? One of the things that I'm pretty well known for is that I don't organize only based on what I'm against. I have to have a vision for what I'm for, because I'm always going to ask the question, what would happen if we won? If you don't have a plan for winning, you only have a plan for defeat. And so, for me, I am fighting to make America a country whose core DNA values finally become human rights. I want to be part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, working with the racial justice wing of the human rights movement, and the LGBT wing of the human rights movement, and the environmental justice wing of the human rights movement. You see where I'm going? I want people elected to office based on how many children they're going to send to college, not how many they're going to send to jail. You know, I want human rights into our political system, our legal system, but mostly I want it for its morality. So we can define letting people starve as a human rights violation, not whether or not somebody gets to own 50,000 guns. Yeah, I just want a different society. And fortunately, we've been gifted with this human rights framework to offer us a vision of what a human rights-based society could look like. You know, and I wish I were smart enough to say I created this all myself and I'm the greatest genius in the world and all of that. I might believe it, but I rarely say it. No, but really, in reality, Dr. Martin Luther King called on us to build a human rights movement. March 31st, 1968, 4 days before he was assassinated. He called on us to build a human rights movement in 1968. And when I first heard that, in 1995, I might add, almost 30 years later, I was so pissed off. Because I mean, the first thing I said was, everybody told me he had a dream. Nobody told me he had a plan. We should have been building a US-based human rights movement holding the United States accountable for its human rights violations domestically and internationally. Instead, we were told, oh, it's just a civil rights movement, fighting for equality, and all of that segregation stuff was solved with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and so we can all go back into our complacent lives. I was pissed off. Go on.
Explain the difference between civil rights and human rights.
Oh, yes. She asked me to explain the difference between civil rights and human rights. There are currently 8 categories of human rights. And most people don't know these 8 categories because we're not taught human rights in our school system like we should be. Civil rights, of course, is a category of human rights. Your right to be treated as an equal, your non-discrimination rights. And that's why the African American movement was called a civil rights movement, because it was fighting for simple equality. I think that there are new civil rights movements out here, like the disability rights movement is a civil rights movement. The trans movement is a civil rights movement. There are new civil rights movements all the time because people don't enjoy simple equality yet. But at the same time, there are other categories. There are economic human rights, your right to have the economy managed in such a way that it meets the needs of the people and just not the needs of the 1% of Wall Street. The whole Occupy movement called attention to economic human rights violations. Did you know that Congress just removed our right to sue banks for fraud? And that's done while Trump tweets some bullshit. Who's paying attention to this? That if a bank defrauds you, you no longer can sue them. Violation of our economic human rights, and we don't even know what's taking place. There are political human rights. Freedom of speech is a human right. The right to vote is a human right. But we've recently learned that we don't have the right to have our votes counted. And of course, they're destroying voting rights as busily as they can. Because like I said, they know our right to vote will not protect white privilege anymore. Then there's social human rights, your right to food, clothing, health care, welfare. Oh, education is a human right. You know why they don't teach you that education is a human right? Because then they couldn't get away with getting you hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt for something that should be free. So they have a financial incentive not to teach us what our human rights are, built into making banks richer. Yeah, that's why what I'm saying, most elementary school kids in the European Union learn this stuff. We don't. The fifth category is called cultural human rights. The right to practice the culture of your choice. Freedom of religion is a human right, for example. But the women's movement needs to learn how to proclaim that freedom from religion is also a human right. We have the human right not to have someone else's religions imposed upon our bodies and our behaviors. That stuff. I think we would fortify our movement if we re-embraced the human rights framework and just moved away from talking about privacy and choice and really did that. Then the sixth category is called environmental human rights. The right to a clean environment, clean water, non-toxic neighborhoods, non-GMO foods. I know I'm running through these, but you need to know what your human rights are, because if you don't know what they are, you can't fight for them. The seventh category is called developmental human rights. That's the right that countries in the global south are demanding to develop their own natural resources. Right now, we are using our armies to invade those countries so that our corporations can extract their natural resources. That's what's going on in Niger. You know, we are building up in Africa right now so that we can extract their natural resources, and we intentionally keep them underdeveloped so they can't contest with us for their own natural resources. Developmental human rights are so important. The eighth category is called sexual human rights. That's the right that the women's movement, the set of rights we demanded, the right to determine if and when we have kids, if and when we marry. The right to sexual pleasure, which is one of my favorites, is a human right. Guess what? You get to tell your partner, you're not doing it right. You're a human rights violator. Which always livens up the conversation in the bourgeois. And I have to say that the rights we enunciated as sexual human rights became so attractive that next thing we knew, the LGBT movement was claiming and defining themselves as a sexual human rights movement. I have a problem with that, though, to be honest. Not that they're not a sexual human rights movement, but I don't want them to make the same mistake African Americans made and fight for only one category of human rights. You've got to fight for all of them. And I don't want to end this portion, because I do need to switch to reproductive justice, without talking about those 8 categories are just what exists now. I think new social justice movements would demand new human rights. I think the 9th category of human rights for which we need to all fight are going to be called digital human rights. Because quickly, if we are not digitally connected, you're not going to be able to access healthcare, education, banking, keeping your utilities on, none of this stuff. And so people on the other side of the digital divide are soon going to be seen as not worthy of the same rights those of us digitally connected enjoy. Talk about privilege. Yeah.
How do we define specifically what human rights are human rights?
What, how do we define?
How do we define specific human rights?
Okay, there's a wonderful document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that defines the first 5 categories, and then because those are more aspirational, I guess that's the word, then there are treaties, conventions, and covenants that turn those categories into law.
Sure, but because human rights law documents are generally more vague than other law documents, so that they can pertain to other.
Well, the First Amendment is vague too. That don't stop it from being enforceable.
So how do we know that we're applying them in a way that works for everyone, in a way that ensures that people get their rights?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that there is that works for everyone part of your question, because by definition, rights are in tension with each other. For example, if you just look at the US, my 14th Amendment right to be free from racial terrorism constantly gets trumped by the First Amendment right of white people to be racial terrorists. Rights by definition battle with each other. They will never be, not totally uncontested. And so one of the things we need to do is become sufficiently conversant with the rights so that we can have these debates, we can have these arguments. But I would also say that if you understand the concept of intersectionality, you will become increasingly comfortable with the concept of ambiguity. That if you're actually looking for absolute certitude in defining this is a right and that's not a right, or this is yours and that's not yours, the human rights framework is not going to offer you that certitude and stuff. And I'm not sure the certitude is something we should pursue anyway. I think it's incumbent upon human society to negotiate with each other for what things mean, not have imposed from the outside. This is what this means, because human rights are also going to be very culturally specific and stuff. So what works in the United States may not work in Iran because of a different history, a different tradition. Human rights are those demands we make of our governments and our corporations and our individuals. So governments and corporations and individuals differ geographically depending on location and stuff. Now, you don't have any fewer human rights because you're no less human if you're in Iran than if you're in the United States, but you're going to come up against different ways of being together based on the specificity of that. But human rights are justiciable, and that's the word they use, that you can take them into courts. If the countries sign and ratify the treaties that go with them, the United States has signed and ratified some of the human rights treaties, but they also take advantage of the fact that the American public doesn't know that they should be held accountable to the treaties that they have signed, and that we should be putting pressure on them to sign someone and ratify the ones that they haven't. For example, the United States is the only industrialized nation that has not ratified the Women's Human Rights Treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The only other countries that haven't ratified that treaty don't have governments. Well, I don't know if we have one now. I mean, I remember. But you see what I'm saying? And so it's a negotiation process, but before we can even take a seat at the table, we have to arm ourselves with the tools to qualify us for that seat. And right now we have a country that's a human rights rogue. And we need to change that. Okay, the reproductive justice framework is based on the human rights framework, which is one of the reasons that you see me foregrounding a discussion on human rights before I talk about reproductive justice. In 1994, 12 black women, including yours truly, decided that the way the Democrats were approaching health care reform under the leadership of then First Lady Hillary Clinton was inadequate. Because for some reason, the Democrats always think that if they throw women's rights under the bus, that the Republicans will like them more. How well do you think that works? But they keep proposing it, right? Even Bernie Sanders, they keep proposing it. Well, they decided that they were going to do health care reform without reproductive health care, which didn't make sense to us because reproductive health care is the #1 driver of women to the doctor. And so why should we get behind and push into place a male-centered health care plan that ignores reproductive health care? Well, when we 12 black women heard this plan, we decided to protest in a fairly mainstream way. We decided to take out a full-page ad in the Washington Post and just say, hey, Congress, you're not going to sneak this by us. And one of the things that we had to consider was that we were 12 black women, but we were from all different organizations. I didn't even work at a women's organization at the time. As Carrie said, I worked at a national anti-Klan organization. Other people worked for Planned Parenthood, NARAL, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, the Black Women's Health Project. One worked for an environmental organization, and on and on. And so we were 12 black women just happened to be at this conference who decided to work together in this plan. And the other thing that we had to consider was that we didn't just want to fight for abortion rights. Even though abortion is vital and fundamental, we felt that abortion was mishandled by the pro-choice movement because it was always isolated from the other social justice issues that women always worry about. For example, when a woman is facing an unplanned pregnancy, there's a whole host of issues that she has to consider. Do I have health care? Can I stay in school? Will my partner beat me? Can I keep my job? Oh, do I have a bedroom to put this child in? I mean, all of these issues that affect whether or not that unplanned pregnancy becomes a wanted pregnancy. If you have good answers to those questions, even though it was unexpected, that doesn't mean it remains unwanted. But if you have bad answers to those questions, an unplanned pregnancy ends up an unwanted pregnancy and is more likely to end up in an abortion. So to start with the abortion never makes sense to us. You've got to go upstream and answer all those questions around violence and economic justice and education rights and gentrification and gun control and all the other issues that affect people before you even get to the pregnancy. And so what we did was splice together the concept of reproductive rights and social justice, and we created the term reproductive justice. By centering black women in the lens, this is what we wanted from healthcare reform, reproductive justice. Now, much to our surprise, even though we just thought of it as a short-term campaign to affect healthcare reform, what we hadn't known was that we were offering a whole new framework to the movement. That in the last 24 years since we did that, or 23 years since we did that, has actually eclipsed the concept of pro-choice, pro-life that people are talking about. That paralysis is no longer, maybe it's outlived its shelf life. I don't know. People are tired of that binary. And reproductive justice has become the currency with which the more radical wing of the reproductive rights movement likes to describe itself. Now, in short, reproductive justice is easy to explain and hard to achieve. We join with the pro-choice movement in fighting for the right not to have a child. That's the first tenet of reproductive justice. So we do support abortion, birth control, abstinence. But because this was a framework created by African American women, we also have to fight equally as hard for the right to have the children that we want to have, because we always have to be in resistance to eugenics and population control. And so avoiding sterilization abuse or those kind of immigration restrictions or whatever that keep us from having the children that we want to have. And then the third tenet of reproductive justice is the right to parent our children in safe and healthy environments, which of course you can't take for granted. That's why we have a Black Lives Matter movement. That's why we have to fight for gun control, for the school to prison pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we created in 1994. Since then, the movement has expanded to include gender nonconforming people. So the fourth tenet that many people are talking about is the right to bodily autonomy and gender identity and self-determination as another aspect of reproductive justice. So like I said, it's pretty easy to define and hard as hell to achieve. But we do base it on the human rights framework, because it's the human rights framework that answers the questions about economic justice, freedom from violence, sexual pleasure, bodily autonomy, a social order where these things can be achieved, those kinds of things. And so let me close by talking about feminist resistance. And then, Carrie, you may want to fill in some blanks that I've overlooked, because you know I'm doing this without a script. I think I'll start talking about resistance from the Pink Pussy March, the march after Inauguration Day. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? The pink pussy hats. And there was a lot of conversation among women of color about whether to participate in this march. A lot of women of color were offended because the original originator, apparently, of the march was a little ahistorical and didn't know that other people had marched before she had the bright idea down in Hawaii. And she originally called it the Million Woman March. Big fail, because there had already been a Black Women's Million Woman March. And, you know, that's how it started. But she was expressing her righteous outrage against the election of Trump. So eventually, through the processes, they added women of color to the leadership team. They made the women of color the most visible leaders of the march. They proceeded to pull the march off. They were a little skittish, in my mind, about collaborating with mainstream white-led organizations, because they were afraid that the Nows and the Feminist Majority and the Planned Parenthood of the world would take over their march, so they didn't want to really collaborate with them. They wanted to be grassroots. Though I do describe those organizations as somewhat grassroots too, mainstream grassroots, but grassroots. So there was this big debate among women of color whether to participate. And I tried to stay out of it, because I was on the staff of NOW for 5 years, and in those 5 years I had helped organize major mobilizations of women. We organized the first abortion rights march in '86. I did the one in '89, and then I was the co-director of the 2004 March for Women's Lives, which had 1.15 million people. So probably among women of color, I probably have the most experience pulling off 500,000 people or more to the nation capital. But I wanted to stay out of it. Except among women of color, the big discourse became, well, we shouldn't go to the march because white women didn't ask us if we wanted to march, and they didn't consult us, and blah, 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 blah. I thought that was such a naive reaction. Are you basically saying that nobody white should do work against white supremacy unless they ask your permission first? That doesn't work for me. I think we should be celebrating when white people do work against white supremacy, however badly they do it. Because that means they ain't with Trump. You know? And I started thinking about it. I said, okay, 53% of white women voted for Trump. But I bet you that ain't the ones organizing this march against Trump. So if we as women of color don't want to work with the 43%, who the hell are we going to work with? Who's white? It just didn't make sense to me, the type of resistance we were we were offering, and excuses we were offering for why not to work with, white women, however clumsy they are. And so I did come out and write a statement about why we should march, and went to my own march in Atlanta, which was great, by the way. 50,000 people marched in Atlanta on that day. That was the largest protest the city of Atlanta had ever seen. And stuff, and I'm talking about Atlanta being the birthplace of the civil rights movement. You would think we'd seen larger ones. Nah, we rocked Atlanta in pouring ass rain. We rocked Atlanta. But that raises the question of, what does feminist resistance look like? I think that feminist resistance to white supremacy has to start with refusing to let white femininity be used as the excuse to attack people of color, number one. Because that is the classic device. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what that means or looks like?
I'll give you an example. Mexican rapist, Trump says. Who do you think he was talking about being raped? White femininity being used to attack people of color. Every time a white person commits a crime, all they have to do is claim a black person did it, and every black person in the community gets arrested. You know what I'm saying? I can give you many more examples, but I think you can think of as many as I can. That's white femininity being used to support white supremacy. And white women need to speak up about that. That device of supporting white supremacy doesn't represent you, doesn't represent how you feel. I can't say that more strongly. Matter of fact, I have to honestly say, and I'll say this in closing, and see if I can give some time to Carrie and Q&A. I am constantly surprised that white people aren't more pissed off. I'm not talking about the politics of resentment that's being manipulated by the right. I'm talking about people on my side being more pissed off. Because if you are white in America, you've had your history stolen. Because you've been sold a bunch of myths about whiteness in America and the manifest destiny that's all around coercing white women into having more babies. I want to know why you ain't pissed. Yeah? And then not only that, but your identities are stolen. When your whoever ancestors came to this country, they were English, they were Italian, they were Polish, they were Irish. Now you're just white. And I find that people who have lost their identities are most jealous of other people having them. Yeah? You should be pissed. And then what really should tip you over the edge is the fact that generations of your children have been brainwashed. I'm teaching white supremacy over at Hampshire, and the first thing my predominantly white class tells me is how pissed off that they didn't learn this stuff before they got to college. Yeah, so this brainwashing of youth, for which some parents are paying $50,000 a year for, should be pissing you the fuck off. So where's the outrage on behalf of white people? I'm already pissed off as a black person, I get that. But I want to know why white people who call themselves radical progressives aren't more pissed off about how their history, their identity, and their children get stolen by this stuff. I don't need an ally. I need someone who's interested in saving the white race. Because this is crazy making. And so I'm trying to teach people about not being ashamed of being white. Because it's not something, that's like, oh, I'm so proud I was born white. I was so proud I was born male. I'm so proud I was born in America. You didn't have nothing to do with none of that. The question is, how can you handle what you were born responsibly, what privileges you were born with responsibly, and how can you challenge the disadvantages every human being has responsibly. We're all victimized violators. Sometimes we get our human rights upheld, and sometimes we get our human rights violated. We need to understand that matrix that makes us up and stuff. And so I invite you to help us form a united movement against white supremacy for human rights with reproductive justice as one of the pathways to get there. That's how I see it kind of working. Intersectionality is our process, but human rights are our goal. That's where we're trying to get to. And I think we're well overdue, almost 60 years overdue, in building that human rights movement that Dr. King wanted us to build a long time ago. So there's a question of, are we ready? And was the Trump election a big enough alarm clock for us to figure this out? Carrie, did you want to say anything before I?
Let's open it up to questions.
Okay, well, this is Q&A time.
Well, thank you for that. My question is, how does, as a white woman, how do I navigate the difference between wanting to be a part and support other identities that maybe I don't identify with? I don't want, you said you don't like the word ally, but I'm going to use it for
Yeah.
this. How do I be like a proper ally without taking over and like grasping onto identities that aren't mine?
Okay. The question is, how do you be a proper ally without taking over? I'm not in the project of teaching white people how to be good allies. I'm in the project of teaching white people how to be appropriately white. That's a different project. So that's your first grappling, how to be appropriately white. How do you own what's good about whiteness? How do you identify and challenge what's bad about whiteness? How do you have risky conversations with your neighbors and your friends and your family instead of trying to distance yourself from them? Try to help them understand some of the understandings that you have, but from a place of love, not anger and contempt because they don't think like you. Once you do your work on your whiteness, you will automatically be an ally. It's trying to perform allyship that's a problem, because you're performing it from a place that doesn't own who you are first. The revolution starts inside before you're in any kind of healthy shape to make revolution with anybody else. And then when you come into it ill-prepared, you expect us to do the work, the emotional labor of helping you figure out who the hell you are. And some of us do it. I love doing it. Most black people say talk to the hand, because they're not willing to do that emotional labor of helping white people figure out whiteness. And so that's the first work that needs to be done. And then allies aren't self-proclaimed. We forget to proclaim who's an ally or not. It's not an identity you can give yourself. It is a trust that you earn so that other people call you that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Back there, I got my glasses on so I can see. Sorry, go on.
So sort of along those lines, people that I know back home are relatively closed-minded, and growing up, my parents didn't really want to talk much about race. It was more.
Sound like my parents.
My parents never wanted to talk about race, and they didn't want to talk about sexuality. They just kind of, just kept it in. So I would like to know, how do I start that conversation with them, and then how can I talk to people who might have problematic opinions about sexuality? For example, I have people back home who might say things against, the crying rape, which makes me particularly angry. But how do I start that conversation without making them feel attacked for their moral opinion?
One of the types of trainings that I provide is called calling in the calling out culture. And you can actually learn techniques for how you can help people better explain themselves Because, like I said, most people think of themselves as good people. We just have to help them be good people and stuff. And so that there's not such a dissonance between what their self-opinion is and what their practices are. And that's a technique, a skill set you could actually learn about helping people align up wanting to be good and actually doing good. You can actually do that. One of the things that I counsel you to avoid is name calling. I invite you to, when somebody says something that's off kilter to you, you can say, you know, that's interesting. Could you tell me more about why you think that way, or what caused you to use that phrase or something? Within my family is uber conservative, a bunch of evangelical Christians, and I'm 65, and we never talked about race or racism or sex or sexuality in my family either. I think my parents were seeking to protect me. I think that's why most parents don't. They seek to protect the innocence of their children. But one thing that is big in my family is the concept of family unity and love. And so I use that shamelessly. You know, when my brother says something that I think is racist, I literally said to my brother Charles, Charles, do you love me? And he looked at me in bewilderment and said, yeah. I said, well, do you know every time you do that or say that, it hurts me? You don't want to hurt me, do you, Charles? Big brotherism just kicked right in for baby sister. So you learn to use you develop a toolkit, and then you learn to use it in very strategic ways to have these difficult dialogues with people. But going home and blowing up the Thanksgiving dinner is rarely productive. You know. Huh? You found that out last year, huh? Yeah, you need to do it. Now, there is a book by a white guy named David Billings called Deep Denial. And I just heard a talk by him in Springfield a couple of weeks ago. And then I got his book and I started reading. And he's a guy from, I think, Mississippi or Louisiana, I'm not quite sure which state. But he has this whole conversation about first how he lived his first 50 or 60 years not understanding white supremacy, and then how he came out of deep denial, and now he goes around the country helping other people come out of deep denial about white supremacy. So that's a memoir kind of teachable book that you could use and secure. But it starts with not seeing people as disposable, even if they have ideas that you don't agree with. And it also starts with coming from a place of love and not anger. Because if you're coming from a place of anger at people, then why should anybody listen to you? Because you're gonna make them feel bad. We need to make people feel good about being good, not bad about feeling good. You know what I'm saying? We just have to have a different set of tools if we want to produce the results we want, which is for people to joyfully join the human rights movement, not feel like they're being pushed into it by whatever coercive strategies we think would work. That's what the other side does. We don't need to do it that way.
Can I just mention, so Loretta's going to be doing a 4-part talk on calling in next semester. It'll be 4 Monday nights workshops, and we'll be announced, it's SWAG sponsored, and we'll be announcing that. But if you want to get more into how to do that kind of working with people that are different in their opinions and how to connect with them, we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of that.
Right. Carrie has been wonderful to allow me to do 8 consecutive workshops starting next semester. Well, actually, I got another one coming up this Monday, right?
Yeah.
Monday, the 6th and the 13th, both on reproductive justice. And then starting next semester will be another series. And they're free and available
so
to...
Monday nights at 7 o'clock in Dewey Common Room, this coming Monday and then the following Monday. And that will finish the 8 from this semester. And then next semester, there'll be 4 on white supremacy and 4 on calling in. So look for the posters.
Right.
I have a question about unconscious racism. So what do you, I read something like about about that like a couple years ago. I don't remember the example, but basically it feels like we don't want racism, but society or background or whatever inputs you, but your brain is like inclined racism unconsciously. Now, how can you avoid that and how you can get back?
Yeah. Unconscious racism or implicit bias, these are the terms that are talked about. First of all, what produces that? The fact that we live in a white supremacist society, first of all, if you're native here, it's a toxic sea. You've drank some of the Kool-Aid already. If you come here as an immigrant, it's the price you pay for assimilation. Is to embrace American values that includes embracing white supremacy and unconscious racism. And so no one is immune to it. There have been so many studies and tests that show that it's prevalent amongst people. Of course, some people have it more than others, but all of us have it to some degree. It's something that you need to know about yourself and monitor within yourself. And there are actually teachable tools that we have in the movement that you can use to do an assessment of yourself and then point out the ways that the things that you need to work on with yourself on that. But let me be clear, it is so universal that you don't need to beat yourself up for it. You need to actively work against it, but not by condemning yourself for acting like every other human being in the country, because you ain't that damn special. Everybody practices some form of implicit bias on something. But you've invited me to go a little deeper. I'm convinced that in order to successfully fight white supremacy, we're going to have to use a non-European philosophical basis. Because too much of European philosophy is based on the concept of othering people. You know, and too much of it is based on the only people for whom I should develop empathy for should be either kin to me or just like me. So it does not create sufficient space for the other. And let me say, and even those of us on the left have embraced that concept, even though we would deny it, because we're so busily saying, well, nobody would oppress me if they just knew me, or if I just got to know them, and you know, all of that. And it's like, that's based on proximity. A proximity-based empathy system is the most shallow empathy system, because there's a whole lot of people that will not get to know you, and you will never get to know that you should care about. You know, I care about whether we drop bombs on Syria, and I've never met a Syrian in my life. And it's not necessary for me to meet a Syrian to care about that. Empathy should not be based on the way they mirror you. You know, we've got to get a different philosophical basis for how we define terms like interdependence, caring, the other, empathy, these kinds of concepts. That isolationist, alienated European philosophy it's outlived its usefulness too, in my opinion. And there are pre-Enlightenment philosophies we could look at, like Ubuntu or Confucianism or other things from which we can sift things that talk about human interdependence in different ways.
Is there a branch in reproductive justice that is working towards male birth control? And if so, is there a way to like adopt that into like mainstream?
People have been working on male birth control forever. It started with the condom. You know, America legalized condom use long before it legalized the pill, so they've always, you know, wanted to protect men's private parts. There is a branch of the movement that works on male birth control, but it's running into a fundamental biological problem. What woman's gonna trust it? What woman is not going to use her own device or pill and say, And when a man says, I'm covered, I'm taking birth control. Really? So there's a real question of, is there a market, and would women who sleep with men trust it anyway? It's just as a plumbing question, and I don't think we've overcome that yet. But I'm not sure that there's a large population of women who aren't in monogamous relationships that would repose enough confidence in a man that says, I'm taking birth control, you don't have to worry about that. You think that might work? So that's kind of why it's an understated part of the movement. I saw you, but I saw one over there, yeah.
I was thinking about, you said that Martin Luther King had like a scheme in his head for where to go with a society that values human rights, and how there's, most people know these human rights and how to like progress towards a plan for that when they're not in America and the kind of education has been denied. I'm wondering if you, in your life and works, and encounter works that have like good plans that you could recommend for reading if you want to think future-wise. Who's got good ideas to read and kind of put our efforts into?
Okay. I would argue that no country does it perfectly. Okay, so if you're looking for the ideal country that does it all right, it doesn't exist. But if you look at the European Union, they've incorporated a lot of the human rights principles with their free health care, with their free educational system, with their social welfare contract. And nobody's arguing that those countries aren't capitalists, but they're able to be capitalists and have a social welfare contract as part of their values right now. Now they've got a whole right wing fighting against that too. And so, you know, how long those things will be in place is a question, because we are globally fighting the resurgence of the far right and the white supremacist system and all of that. So you could choose, you could extract some things from how other countries are doing it. Some countries do better on women's rights and have more parity in women in elected offices and stuff. Some countries ratify the treaties and they don't mean it. And so, you know, you don't want to take up those examples either. The problem with human rights, well, there's a lot of problems with human rights, so I'm not trying to offer it as a panacea, like it's going to solve all our problems immediately. One of the problems is that human rights, by definition, are limits on government power. So what government is going to voluntarily limit its power? Not a one. Not a one. So human rights have to be won from the ground up, not imposed from the top down. They never happen that way. Okay, and so that's a problem. Secondly, it is dependent on a nation-state system for enforcement, you know, countries and nations and stuff. Some of us would argue that since crime and environmental problems and immigration and refugees and climate change are without borders, why are we going to a border-based system? But at the same time, I think it's a pathway to where we are a borderless world, but we ain't there yet. I actually think we probably won't even inch there until ET comes. Then we're suddenly saying, oh, I'm sorry, I know you're Iranian, but right now, he's from somewhere else. You know? So I think that a lot of things have to change before we recognize the inanity of borders. But maybe several hundred years in the future, maybe when ET comes tomorrow. I'm not quite sure when that transition is going to happen. And there's a weakness of the system. And in the United States, there's a particular weakness, because there's more than 26 human rights treaties out there that the United States has failed to ratify. You know, and ratification takes a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Matter of fact, it's in Article 6 of our own U.S. Constitution, where it says if the Senate ratifies a treaty, it's the same as if Congress passed the law. Well, what that means is that the Senate doesn't like ratifying treaties, because that would mean that all the present forms of discrimination that they enjoy the privilege of would become illegal and stuff. And so they literally don't like ratifying treaties, because they know Article 6 would kick in and make them live up to those laws and stuff. And so we've got to build political pressure using the human rights framework to even get the Congress to do its damn job. which is to ratify the available treaties that are out there, like the Women's Human Rights Treaty or the Children's Treaty. And then when we do ratify them, we don't mean it. We ratified the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Torture, but we won't shut down Guantanamo. You know, so we ratify them and then wink, wink, nod, ignore them because we know we're the biggest, baddest bully in the world and who's going to make us obey human rights laws. So like I said, when I call us a rogue country, that's how the world sees us. The developed world sees us as a rogue country. And we're so self-satisfied thinking we're the greatest country, and most people think we're the greatest buffoons in the world. Try to go to Europe right now and explain how Trump got elected. I try to add a French accent to my voice so nobody really asks me that question. Because they act like I got an American passport and I'm personally responsible for this jerk or something.
Maybe one more question.
I saw her hand.
I was just wondering, you were talking about resources for like identifying bias, kind of like within yourself, and I just wondered if you could talk more about those resources and like.
Oh, they're available massively on Google. Yeah. Implicit, if you just put in the word implicit bias or unconscious racism, you will get a sheaf of information. There's a whole industry around that. I'm not part of that industry because I fight white supremacy very specifically, and I try to keep focused on building an anti-fascist movement that fights white supremacy in pursuit of human rights. So I don't necessarily do diversity trainings or implicit bias work. I mean, it's all very necessary, kind of like they're the sister struggle, but that's just not my forte. I'm more into upfront confronting fascism. Thank y'all for listening to me today.